Holy shit, one of them finally did it. One of them is actually going to try and address the economic calculation problem.
But because people keep bringing it up every now and then at least and asking me, I will now do a video specifically about the so-called calculation problem or the economic calculation problem.
You needed a final solution for those dirty capitalist trolls who kept poking holes in your fruity little fairy tales.
Basically, it's this idea pushed by libertarians and ANCAPs.
I'd just like to point out really quick that the reason there are so many foreclosed homes is not because of the market. It's because of government-run banks like Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae flat out refusing to back up loans which go bad, and the Community Reinvestment Act, which basically had the government pouring money into the market to try and expand on low-income housing in the aim of trying to fight the manufactured political problem of income inequality, which effectively removed any incentive for anyone to pay the home loans. Just to respond to his little propaganda image in the background, which is completely unrelated to the subject at hand.
That there's an inherent problem with economic planning that it just inevitably will always fail and can't work because of this calculation problem. Of course, it's kind of funny because it's the market that has all these inevitable contradictions and problems that can be mitigated by regulation, but in themselves cannot be solved.
Regulation is a large part of the reason why problems in the market exist to begin with, and the Marxist argument for contradictions in capitalism are completely ignorant of the function of supply and demand in relation to the economy, and therefore can be dismissed as pseudoscientific at most. As for regulation being the cause of most of the market's issues, I would need to be presented with a more specific example in order to refute this claim, but we can observe this with the fact that there's a direct correlation between government influence in a market and the cost with availability.
Capitalism reaches a crisis, I don't know, approximately every 10 years, maybe even more frequently than that, and then the state steps in and saves it.
The government has only been bailing out companies since 1929. Funnily enough, prior to government bailouts, when the market crashed, it rose back up within around 6 months to a year. You'll also notice that the economy starts to become incredibly volatile around 1913, which was the year that the Federal Reserve Act was signed into law. Don't get me wrong, there were plenty of regulations prior to 1913 which caused problems, such as the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887, which made railroad travel significantly more scarce and expensive due to price fixing, or the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, which is still in law today, and is particularly infamous because despite being in direct violation of the Commerce Clause, it's still been in existence for nearly 130 years, proof that the government is not obligated to follow its own rules, and further proving just how useless the social contract is and how the government only selectively applies it to citizens.
And that's how the market still exists today.
Really? Well then, would you please care to explain how between 1792, when the Philadelphia Stock Exchange was founded, and 1929, when the government began bailing out companies, the market not only existed but was thriving?
So basically, the libertarians who push the idea of the economic calculation problem, they say that it is impossible for planned economy to come up with prices that accurately reflect the values of commodities, and that it's impossible for the planners to correctly allocate resources and to correctly estimate demand and such, and then produce commodities to meet that demand. Well, I mean, there's immediately totally obvious problems with this argument. Basically, it's begging the question. The whole thing is begging the question.
What? No, it isn't. The argument against central planning using the economic calculation problem is centered around a very simple and consistent line of reasoning. In a centrally planned market, supply and demand isn't factored into resource allocation, and because of this, price ratios cannot be established, and because price ratios cannot be established, it is impossible to allocate resources because you can't make heads or fucking tails of a commodity's value.
Or doing some other kind of fallacious thing like that. These people say that it's impossible for the planners to come up with accurate prices for commodities. That is such a non sequitur, like who cares?
Actually, it's a big fucking deal, because if you can't determine in what quantity a commodity should be distributed in, then you're going to experience a shortage, which is precisely the reason why centrally planned economies always experience them. I'm beginning to think that you're just throwing out the names of random fallacies in a vain attempt to make yourself sound intelligent because you know that you have no argument. In reality, it just makes you sound like a scrub.
Right? Like, the prices in socialism are not meant to reflect, I don't know, the value of a product or the production cost of a product. They're meant to, they're planned.
So basically, centrally planned models can properly allocate their resources because...
Imagination.
Yeah, no. Because Marx said so is not an answer. Using your claim to refute criticism of your claim is the sort of knuckle-dragging anti-intellectual bullshit that the likes of Ray Comfort would use to refute criticisms of creationist theory from evolutionary biologists.
People just decide them. Like, that's the whole point.
And our whole point is that under a centrally planned model, that isn't what would happen because value is not possible to determine without supply and demand. And because it can't be determined, proper resource allocation is not possible. If I were to tell you that gravity doesn't affect me, and you rightfully called me on my bullshit, and I were to tell you, "Nuh-uh, but gravity doesn't," would you walk away saying to yourself, well shit, I guess gravity doesn't affect him after all? No, of course you wouldn't, and it's stupid to expect others to do the same thing when you pull the same crap in regard to economics.
Morons. Like, in all socialist countries, luxury things like, I don't know, fine wine or something like that, like fancy shoes and cars, have been really expensive. And like, you know, look at Cuba, like rum is expensive, tobacco is expensive, while medical care is entirely free and food is really cheap.
That is an absolute crock of shit. First thing to note is that Cuba has separate facilities for foreign tourists and government officials which the general population of Cuba do not have access to. And, of course, journalism in Cuba is completely unreliable since dissent against the regime is illegal, which effectively makes any and all journalism, quote-unquote, coming out of Cuba, government propaganda. All primary and first-hand sources from the citizens completely differ from the regime's accepted opinion, which should tell you something. Yeah, they have hospitals, but the buildings are literally falling apart. Conditions are completely unsanitary, and doctors are known to reuse the same gloves multiple different times for different people, and basics that we have over here in market economies such as aspirin or antibiotics typically can't be found because, guess what, the government can't properly allocate its resources. And the pills which are found typically are found on black markets and cost several months' income. Link will be in the description.
That's planned.
Yeah, and it's absolute garbage to the point where I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemies. Your point?
They've deliberately done it in such a way that people can all get necessities. Like, rent is really cheap and it's guaranteed for 5 years at a time, so people can rest easily and they know that, yeah, we're gonna have a roof above our heads.
The thing that Cuba sympathizers will never tell you is the quality of the commodities available and can everyone receive them. The reason that they will never tell you that is because everything sucks, and that's even if the people are lucky enough to receive it to begin with.
And yeah, we're going to be able to afford food and medicine and education and public transport. That is called freedom. That is what freedom is.
Oh shit. A country where the people have absolutely no individual autonomy and no right to their own lives. That is a free country according to socialists. Okay.
Knowing that you don't have to worry about basic necessities, knowing that I'm gonna be fine, I'm gonna have healthcare, I'm gonna be able to keep my home, I'm going to be able to eat, I am going to be able to get to the places where I need to go, my kids will be able to go to school. All those things, they're actual concrete rights and freedoms that people are offered in socialism.
Oh, I get it. So, by freedom, you don't mean actual freedom. What you mean is the right to free shit and the abolition of all personal responsibility. Rights do not exist in a positive context where an action gives you rights. Rights only exist in a negative context where action can only infringe upon them. So, basically, everything you inherently have that can only be taken from you by the initiation of force, life, or autonomy are rights. The reason rights don't exist in a positive context is due to the fact that in order to sustain something as a thing which someone is entitled to, arbitration is required, since positive rights are entirely subjective, and because of this, force must be initiated in order to sustain the system, since it is an artificial standard which not everyone conforms to. And because of this, it is a position which cannot be defended due to the initiation of force being a contradiction, since the initiation of force requires an inherent double standard, because the institutional application of force cannot exist unless the people having force applied to them are suppressed. Otherwise, they would just use force in response, and then the whole system wouldn't work. Sorry, commies, but freedom is inherently tied with responsibility. You cannot have one without the other. And the greater amount of freedom you have, the more responsibility you have.
We don't care about the price, like it's planned, it's not meant to reflect the accurate whatever, market value of a commodity. That's never been the point.
Just because you didn't take something into account when thinking about your theory does not mean that the thing you forgot is insignificant. And in this case, it's the exact opposite of being insignificant. The thing you forgot is so important, as a matter of fact, that your system is doomed to fail because it doesn't include it.
Nobody cares. Not to mention, according to these libertarians who usually subscribe to the subjective value theory, because they don't actually subscribe to the labor theory of value, they subscribe to a subjective value theory. So according to them, price is completely arbitrary.
That is a very gross oversimplification. The demand curve in the supply and demand is determined by consumer interest and marginal utility, and therefore no commodity has objective value because demand changes constantly as a result of interest and marginal utility being entirely subject to individual preference. We're not just like, yeah, it's arbitrary because fuck the rules, man. No, we have a pretty sound and rational explanation for our position.
The value comes from the labor theory of value. The price will fluctuate. But according to libertarians, who subscribe to a subjective value theory, they think that the price is just whatever people are willing to pay. That is the price. That is the accurate price that reflects the correct value and cost of a product. Like, you can have some small group of rich people, like...
Oh shit, he mentioned rich people. I guess this is when we start getting into the identity politics.
Like, bid against each other and then, like, compete to be able to buy some rare art piece or something, and then that's going to be valued at a higher price than the entire, like, livelihood and necessities of millions of people.
Now, that is just a flat-out straw man. People don't make one interaction, then the one price the object was exchanged for that one time is the set price for the rest of all interactions it's ever involved in. No. Whatever the rare art piece in this case is sold for this specific interaction is how much it's worth to the individual who wins the bid. To you or I, neither of us would spend millions of dollars on some rare art piece because I presume neither of us want it that badly, nor, I presume, would we be willing to exchange that much of the product of our labor in order to purchase something so trivial. So the value of that commodity to us would not be the same. Hence, value is subjective, not arbitrary or made up, subjective, as in up to the individual.
You think that's reasonable? You think that's rational?
Well, of course, that's the product of their own autonomy. They can do whatever they like with it. I mean, they can buy that art piece and fuck it for all I care.
It's totally arbitrary. Like, in subjective value theory, nothing in the real world matters. It's all just what's in a person's mind. Like, okay, I'm really thirsty, so I value water more. If I don't get water, I'll die, so therefore you can get me to pay anything for water.
What if an individual is going on a thirst strike? Or what if somebody lives next to a lake or has tap water? Goddamn, stuff starts to get really cheap once you start taking variables into account that Marxists conveniently leave out to instead frame people as mindless automatons who, by the way, just so happen to be different enough from one another conveniently based solely on how much money that they make, that Marxists can use that little minute difference to use identity politics.
Even though it's still the same water, the water is not any more valuable, the water is not any more expensive.
What if the water has like a bunch of mosquito larvae swimming around in it? Or what if the water is out of somebody's toilet? I seriously doubt you would be willing to pay the same for toilet water as you would for a nice bottle of water from the store.
But because I am subjectively more prone to wanting water right now, that somehow inflates the price.
Alright, you've established that you don't know how subjective value works. Wait a minute. I just realized he literally only talks about the economic calculation problem for like a minute, and then the rest of the video has absolutely nothing to do with it. It's just standard Marxist bullshit. Well, so much for this supposed debunking of the economic calculation problem. Will Marxists ever find a solution to the economic calculation problem?